facts, all these people aren't here to see you. You know what I'm saying?
Look at all the people here tonight.
For decades, fans speculated about the bad blood between Sammy Hagar and David Lee Roth. Now, at 77, Sammy finally confesses what really drove a wedge between them, and it's worse than anyone imagined. The rivalry didn't just start when Sammy stepped into the glaring spotlight of Van Halen in 1985, replacing the famously flamboyant David Lee Roth. No, this was a storm brewing long before microphones and arenas could witness it. When Roth left the band at the height of their fame, fans didn't just lose a frontman, they were forced to pick sides. And when Sammy walked on stage, he brought a completely different energy. David was a showman through and through, strutting like a rock god, all flash, all spectacle. Sammy, by contrast, was grounded in musicianship, determined to let the music speak louder than the antics. Even from their earliest appearances, the tension between these two men was impossible to ignore. Interviews were laced with subtle digs, awkward silences, and sideways glances. In public, the media painted it as nothing more than ego clashing with two titans battling for the same throne. But as Sammy tells it now, the truth was far more personal, far more bitter than anyone dared to imagine. The quiet hostility followed them for decades, haunting even the so-called reconciliation during their ill-fated Sam and Dave tour. Night after night, the two shared a stage but hardly a word. The air between them was thick with unspoken contempt, so much so that fans began to question whether the magic was even real anymore. Why couldn't two legendary rock icons at least pretend to get along? Why couldn't they bury the hatchet for the sake of the music and the fans? It's a question that lingered, unanswered, in the minds of millions until now. Because at 77, Sammy finally pulls back the curtain, revealing not just a petty rivalry, but a deep philosophical chasm. A clash of integrity, style, and soul that no amount of fame or fortune could ever mend. But to understand Sammy's resentment, we have to go back to the chaotic years that tore Van Halen apart. Sammy pulls back the curtain on the darkest days of Van Halen, revealing how the band spiraled into dysfunction after tragedy struck their manager. In 1995, everything that once held Van Halen together crumbled in silence. Ed Loeffler, Sammy's mentor, protector, and trusted manager, succumbed to cancer. He had been more than a manager. He was the glue that kept the band from tearing itself apart, the steady hand in a storm of egos and temptation. His death wasn't just a personal loss for Sammy, it created a void, a dangerous emptiness that the industry's vultures wasted no time filling. Without Ed's watchful presence, the sharks circled. Managers, promoters, hangers-on, they all saw an opportunity to reshape Van Halen to their liking. And Eddie Van Halen, vulnerable and devastated, became their easiest target. Sammy watched in disbelief as those closest to Eddie whispered poison into his ear. Friends become strangers overnight. Allies turned to adversaries. The sense of brotherhood they'd built was torn apart thread by thread, and no one seemed willing or able to stop it. It was then that a new manager arrived, slipping through the cracks and gaining Eddie's trust. But instead of healing the wounds, this man deepened them, feeding lies and paranoia into every conversation, turning the bandmates into suspicious enemies. Sammy, once the leader and voice of reason, found himself increasingly isolated. Meetings turned hostile, phone calls turned cold, and one day, it was over. In a haze of betrayal and bitterness, he was ousted, blindsided by a wave of backroom deals and whispered accusations that he never saw coming. The loss of Ed Loeffler had left Eddie unmoored, his behavior increasingly erratic, his judgment clouded. Sammy, watching from the outside now, began to understand just how far the chaos had sunk its claws. And somewhere in that chaos, the seeds of his contempt for David Lee Roth began to grow. Because while the band burned, while loyalty dissolved and trust disintegrated, Sammy couldn't help but trace the dysfunction back to what he believed was a toxic legacy left in Roth's wake, a legacy of spectacle over substance, ego over everything else. As if the backstage politics weren't enough, the reunion with David Lee Roth brought Sammy face to face with a nightmare he could no longer ignore. What was meant to be a triumphant reunion turned into Sammy's worst nightmare, a chaotic tour filled with drugs, fights, and humiliation. The 2004 reunion tour should have been a celebration, a victory lap for a band that had once conquered the world. Fans packed arenas, expecting to witness history, but what they saw instead was a tragedy unfolding in real time. From the very first rehearsal, Sammy could tell something was deeply wrong. Eddie Van Halen was not the man he once knew. Sammy describes him now as unrecognizable, his brilliance buried under layers of self-destruction, his body carrying the scars of addiction, his spirit fractured by years of excess and grief. He was drunk, he was incoherent, and he was hell-bent on tearing apart everything they had built. Night after night, the shows fell into chaos. Songs dissolved halfway through, Eddie's fingers fumbling over chords he once played effortlessly. He would start one tune and veer off into something no one recognized, leaving Sammy and the others exchanging desperate glances, trying to salvage the moment. The crowd didn't always notice at first, but the cracks widened quickly. Sammy began to dread each night, sitting backstage in silence, waiting to hear the guitar that signaled Eddie had actually made it to the stage. And each time he heard it, relief was mixed with a heavy sense of foreboding. Sammy feared Eddie would die on that tour. The drinking was relentless, the outbursts unpredictable. One moment Eddie would be smashing bottles on a plane at 40,000 feet. The next he'd vanish, only to appear hours later in the same filthy clothes, a wine bottle in hand, eyes wild. Sammy, watching this unravel, finally reached his breaking point. Halfway through the tour, after the 40th show, he tried to quit. He told management he couldn't keep enabling this spectacle, couldn't watch a friend destroy himself any longer. But there was no way out. The legal contracts were ironclad. Walking away meant paying back millions, leaving the crew and the band in chaos. So he stayed. Night after night, he endured the nightmare, finishing what he'd started, all the while feeling himself being dragged deeper into the darkness Eddie had created. And somewhere in the chaos, Sammy began to see something familiar in it all. A reflection of the dysfunction he believed David Lee Roth had brought to the band years earlier. The arrogance, the recklessness, the disregard for the music itself. It left a scar, one that would never fully heal. But even before the reunion, Sammy's feelings about David Lee Roth were already complicated, rooted in very different visions of what Van Halen should be. Sammy reveals that his disdain for David came not from jealousy, but from a fundamental clash in personality, artistry, and integrity. From the beginning, Sammy and David were destined to collide because they came from entirely different worlds. Sammy had grown up idolizing musicians who built their craft on skill and soul legends like Eric Clapton, Jimmy Page, Pete Townshend, and Steve Winwood. To him, rock and roll was about mastery, authenticity, and respect for the music. He wanted to stand on a stage and feel the weight of every note resonate with meaning. That was the dream. But when he joined Van Halen, he was walking into a band whose frontman embodied everything he despised. To Sammy, David Lee Roth wasn't a musician. He was a spectacle, a man obsessed with his own image, more interested in acrobatics and antics than the substance of what they were playing. Behind the smirks and flamboyant routines, Sammy saw something hollow, a carefully constructed persona designed to distract from a lack of depth. And it gnawed at him. He began to believe that David was fake, all style and no soul, masking his shortcomings with glitter and theatrics. That frustration only deepened when Sammy realized something else. His own legacy had shaped Van Halen long before he arrived, but David would never acknowledge it. Back in the Montrose days, Sammy and his band had influenced an entire generation of hard rock bands, including Van Halen themselves. Eddie and Alex had once looked to Montrose with admiration, yet David pretended as if Sammy was just another hired gun. That slight, whether intentional or not, cut deep. More than anything, Sammy saw wasted potential in what Van Halen had become during the Roth years. They had Eddie, a genius of his time, a man capable of redefining the guitar. But instead of showcasing that brilliance, David's antics turned the band into something closer to a circus act. To Sammy, the clownish image of early Van Halen, the leotards, the splits, the absurdity mocked what the music could have been. He couldn't stand to watch genius buried under gimmickry. It was this chasm, this irreconcilable divide in their visions of rock and roll, that made it impossible for Sammy to respect David as a peer. It was never about fame, or who sold more tickets, or who looked better on a poster. It was about integrity, and Sammy felt David had traded it away for applause. Yet despite their differences, fate and a Ferrari would soon entangle Sammy with Van Halen forever. A chance encounter over a Ferrari would catapult Sammy Hagar into Van Halen, and set the stage for one of rock's greatest rivalries. It began with nothing more than a car. Sammy had just bought himself a rare Ferrari 512 Boxer, as a reward for years of relentless work. a symbol of independence and triumph. He left it in the care of a trusted mechanic in Los Angeles, never imagining it would become the spark that lit a fire neither he nor Van Halen could ever extinguish. While Sammy was away on tour, Eddie Van Halen stopped by that same garage, his own Lamborghini's in need of service. And that's when he saw it gleaming, immaculate, and undeniably impressive. Eddie pointed to the Ferrari and asked casually, "Whose car is that?" When the mechanic replied, "That belongs to Sammy Hagar," something shifted. Eddie already knew who Sammy was. He'd crossed paths with him before and admired Montrose, the band Sammy helped define. But seeing that car at that moment made Eddie curious, even intrigued. He pressed further, asking for Sammy's phone number, and right there in the mechanic's office, picked up the phone. It was a call that would rewrite both their lives. Sammy agreed to meet and jam, more out of curiosity than expectation. But from the moment they started playing, it was electric. Sammy recalls how they felt like kids again, laughing, experimenting, daring each other to push the limits of their sound. Eddie bounced between guitar and keyboard with an ease that left Sammy stunned, and Sammy's vocals soared higher than any of them had anticipated. In that session, they were no longer strangers or even professionals. They were dreamers again, caught up in the magic of creation. Soon after, Sammy officially joined Van Halen, stepping into a band at the height of its power. Together they would sell over 42 million records, achieving #1 albums, sold-out world tours, and a cultural dominance few bands in history could claim. But Sammy's entrance into Van Halen didn't just mark a new chapter. It closed the book on another. David Lee Roth was out. The frontman who had once been inseparable from Van Halen's identity was gone, replaced by a man who represented everything he wasn't. And with that change, a line was drawn. Fans chose sides. Some clung to Roth's theatrical chaos. Others embraced Sammy's sincerity and artistry. That division would haunt the band for decades and fuel the quiet feud between its two frontmen. When Sammy and David finally toured together in the early 2000s, fans expected fireworks on stage, but no one knew how icy it was backstage. It was billed as the ultimate fantasy for Van Halen devotees of the Sam and Dave tour. Two eras of the band's history colliding in a single show, promising to unite the loyalists and thrill the crowds. Posters dripped with nostalgia. Tickets sold out in hours. But the illusion ended the moment the lights went out. Behind the scenes, the truth was colder than anyone imagined. Sammy and David barely spoke. They would pass each other in hallways without a nod, exchanging glances in the wings that carried decades of bitterness. Whatever camaraderie the audience believed in was pure fiction, crafted to sell seats. For Sammy, it was like stepping into a bad memory he'd tried to bury. Every night, he watched David roll out the same act he'd been doing since the 80s. The same exaggerated kicks, the same rehearsed banter, the same hollow flash. Nothing had changed, and nothing, Sammy realized, ever would. To him, David seemed stuck in time, trapped in a caricature of himself, unwilling or unable to grow as an artist or even as a man. Sammy couldn't hide his resentment. He didn't just dislike David's showmanship, he despised how David treated the stage like his personal circus, refusing to connect as a real bandmate. Every gesture felt scripted, every word a performance meant for strangers, rather than the people standing beside him. And every night, Sammy felt himself pulled further from the idea that this was ever about the music. The tension didn't stay hidden for long. It seeped into the performances. Fans who looked closely could feel a stiffness between songs, a subtle distance in how they shared the spotlight. Yet, somehow, they managed to keep it professional, never letting the bitterness explode outright in front of the audience. For all the fire in their rivalry, both men understood the stakes, and both refused to let the cracks show entirely. Still, Sammy would later call the tour surreal, even miserable, a confirmation of everything he'd suspected about David all along. It didn't heal the rift, it widened it. And by the time it ended, Sammy knew there was no bridge left to build. As time went on, Sammy reflected on David's contribution to Van Halen and found some small acknowledgments, if not respect. At 77, Sammy is finally willing to admit the few things he admired about David Lee Roth, but stops short of offering forgiveness. Time has a way of softening edges, even the sharpest ones. Decades of distance have given Sammy room to reflect, to sift through the chaos and bitterness, and to pull out what truth he can from the wreckage. And in that truth, he finds a reluctant respect for the role David played, not as a musician, but as a force. He admits now that David's showmanship drew the world's eyes to Van Halen in those early years. The way he strutted, howled, and captivated crowds built a spotlight wide enough to include everyone, especially Eddie. Sammy can't deny that it was David's flamboyant presence on stage that helped the audience see Eddie's genius at the center. He even concedes that David's stage antics, however alien to him, created an unforgettable spectacle. Sammy had no taste for it, he still doesn't, but he can't dismiss how it worked. The man knew how to sell a show, and when Sammy listens back now to some of the early Van Halen lyrics, he's surprised to find himself nodding. Silly though they were at times, there was cleverness in them. A certain wit that cut through and stuck with people. That kind of craft, even wrapped in flash and irony, deserved acknowledgement. But what Sammy can never concede is that David embodied what the band could have been. To him, David introduced Van Halen to the world, but never let it live up to its potential. He gave the world a dazzling circus, and in the process hid what really mattered. The music, the craftsmanship, the depth. That, Sammy still insists, only came alive after he joined. To this day, he believes his tenure with the band unlocked a sound and integrity they never had before. So he calls it plainly now. David was a great showman, nothing more. Not a musician, not a peer, and certainly not a friend. A man who could dazzle the world, but never earn his respect. Sammy's voice carries no venom when he says it anymore, just finality. And yet, Sammy's story is as much about himself as it is about his rival, about survival, integrity, and refusing to compromise his values. After decades of turbulence, Sammy reflects on his own journey and what really matters at the end of the day. Through it all, Sammy has learned one truth, that no tour, no rivalry, no betrayal could ever take from him the power of staying true to oneself. That principle became his anchor, as storms raged around him, when the band fractured, when the bitterness of others threatened to consume him. He refused to compromise his integrity, even when it cost him friendships, fame, and comfort. That choice, though often lonely, has become the foundation of his peace today. Despite the chaos that marked his years with Van Halen, he holds a deep, abiding love for the music and the fans who embraced it. Those moments on stage when the lights hit and the sound roared were real, untouchable, and still burn bright in his memory. No bitterness can dim the connection he felt with the audiences who sang every word back to him. That bond remains sacred. Sammy has since carved out a life that defies the cliché of the broken rock star. A successful solo career, thriving business ventures, and a calm personal life. These are not accidents, but the fruits of resilience. He credits his survival not to luck, but to his unyielding passion for music and his refusal to let anyone else define him. That refusal to bend, even when it would have been easier to simply play along, became his redemption. Over time, even he and Eddie found a fragile sort of reconciliation, though it came too late to heal the scars completely. With David, however, the chasm never closed. Sammy accepts now that it was never meant to. Some differences cannot be bridged, and he has made his peace with that. Today, when Sammy looks back, he doesn't see a feud anymore, he sees a story. A chapter in a bigger book, filled with triumphs, betrayals, and lessons he carries forward. The rivalry, the headlines, the bitterness were just parts of the journey, not the destination. He smiles at it now, wiser and unshaken, knowing it all shaped the man he became. And so, with a final word, Sammy leaves us with the truth unfiltered, unapologetic, and unforgettable. After decades of silence, Sammy finally spells it out. The real reason he couldn't stand David Lee Roth, and why it still matters today. The truth, as Sammy tells it now, was never about envy, never about outshining the man who came before him. His contempt for David ran much deeper, rooted in what he saw as a fundamental difference in integrity and artistry. From the moment he joined Van Halen, Sammy sensed a shadow hanging over the band. Not just the legacy of David's tenure, but the corrosive spirit it had left behind. In his eyes, David was self-serving, shallow, dismissive of the music's true potential. And that disregard, not just for the craft, but for the brotherhood that could have been, was something Sammy could neither ignore nor forgive. What David brought to the stage, Sammy now calls a distraction. Every antic, every preening gesture, every cheap laugh came at the expense of something more meaningful. Sammy had dreamed of a band where the music and the message carried weight, where honesty and passion stood above showmanship. But David's behavior clashed with that vision at every turn. He saw a man who treated rock like a costume rather than a calling, and that was a betrayal Sammy would never stomach. Through the years, The feud fed on itself jealousy, manipulation, and the constant division of fans stoking flames neither man could extinguish. But even as the tabloids thrived on the spectacle, Sammy insists his feelings were never manufactured. The bitterness was real because the disappointment was real. He never set out to defeat David, never sought to win in the public's eyes. For Sammy, it was simpler and more personal. He could not compromise his values for applause. And now, at 77, there is no longer any need to sugarcoat it. No more half-truths, no more diplomacy. The words roll off his tongue with finality. He was a showman, not a musician, and I couldn't stand that. In that single sentence, decades of conflict crystallize into a truth. Sammy no longer feels the need to soften. And so the curtain falls, not just on a rivalry, but on a chapter of rock history that will be debated forever, with Sammy's final words echoing louder than ever. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.